And welcome to the 237th episode of the DLF Dynasty podcast. I am your host, Dan Myler. You may be wondering why you're not hearing the sultry sounds of George Kritikos' voice. Well, I am told that since he's our MVP, he earned a playoff bye. So instead of the smooth Matt Ryan-like delivery you get from George every week, you'll have to suffer through the scattershot delivery of his backup. Although I just realized that if George is Matt Ryan, then I'm George, and I'm George's backup, that would make me Matt Schaub. So if I ever get the chance to host again after this horrible intro, I'll try to come up with a better analogy. Luckily, we have somebody here to save the day, my co-host, Matt Price. He'll play the role of Julio Jones, I guess, and hopefully make me look better than I did in this intro. How you doing, Matt?
I'm doing great, although if I'm Julio, then I'm going to go ahead and rest my toe this weekend because I would rather him not play against our Packers on Sunday.
Yeah, I don't know if everybody knows, and we're going to spend a majority of this week's pod talking about startup strategies, and we have an excellent guest to get to. But before we do any of that, in case you don't know, Matt and I are both big Packer fans, and I imagine you experienced similar elation when Mason Crosby's kick veered inside the upright on Sunday. Before we get to any other divisional round notes, let's talk about that a little bit, Matt. How high was your blood pressure as the foot met the ball? And are they going to beat Atlanta this weekend?
Well, I'm going to say yes. I feel like
Rodgers,
yeah, totally. I feel like Rodgers is playing at the top of his game, man. He's playing against a pass defense that, them playing better. Got Vic Beasley rushing the passer, but otherwise, I don't really think they're good enough to stop with him with the way he's playing right now. I do think it's probably going to be a shootout, sort of like in Week 8, which is like what started that 4-game losing streak and caused everybody to freak out about it. But there was no Clay Matthews in that game, no Randall Cobb. We might have Jordy in this one. We'll still see about that. But I like their chances. I do think it's still going to be a shootout, high-scoring game, probably 30 points plus from both teams. But let's bring one home for the good guys, huh?
Yeah, that doesn't sound too bad. I'd love to see it. I kind of think that it's going to be the one defensive play that'll change that game. If one of those teams can make one defensive play, that'll swing things. Hopefully it goes in Green Bay's favor. But enough Homer talk about the Green Bay Packers. All our Bears and Vikings and Lions fans, as well as the rest of those teams in the NFL, those fans are sick of that. Let's introduce our guest for tonight's episode, a fellow DLF scribe, as well as a writer and editor at Number Fire. It's Austin Cass. Austin, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. How are you guys?
We're doing good. I'm pretty excited to talk to you, Austin. With talking about startup strategies and things like that. You and I were going to start up together a year ago, or actually about 6 months ago before the season. It was the Bustapalooza startup in Chicago. I'm sure a lot of our fans and listeners have heard about that. And you ended up winning that league. So your dominance in that league will hopefully come over the airwaves today, and we can help all our listeners win next year's championships in the first year of their leagues, right?
Yeah, I don't think making stuff. It was a lot of fun to be in. I think draft, meeting everybody, that was get together like that. That was really fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Before we get to any of that stuff, though, let's talk about a couple of divisional round notes that kind of caught my eye over this past weekend as we kind of look forward to championship weekend. Will Fuller's the first one that pops into my head. I think he just dropped another pass. I tweeted after that it was a it was a monumental drop, just horrible. I tweeted that dynasty owners should take notice that this is a recurring issue and that it's going to continue. I feel like the Houston coaching staff is sure to get sick of these drops. I'd love to know what you two think of it. Matt, are you passing on Will Fuller for the future? Are you a seller, or are you going to buy him this offseason with that huge drop that he committed the other day?
I think at his current price, which is wide receiver 37, off the board around 5'11" in January ADP, I'm probably selling or holding at that point. There are players behind him that I like better. Malcolm Mitchell, for one. It's really a shame that he dropped that ball. I mean, that was really the best pass of Brock Osweiler's entire career. I mean, how heartbreaking must it be for Osweiler there, for him to drop that? It's really weird because they had such chemistry early on. In week 1, he had 5 for 107 and a touchdown. Week 2, 4 for 104. Week 3, 7 for 81 and a touchdown. And then it just fell off the cliff. So honestly, I really don't know what to think about that guy. In terms of the drops, I don't know. I kind of value those less than, I guess, maybe than other dynasty owners. Like, for instance, my number one guy is Mike Evans, and he drops his fair share of passes. Everybody loves Amari Cooper. He drops his fair share of passes. So that's not really it for me. I think it's really just that situation. I think that Hopkins is the better receiver, and unless that chemistry comes back with Osweiler, or they get a better quarterback, I guess. I don't know. I don't see much hope for Will Fuller outside of maybe like best ball leagues and like a bye week or injury filler at this point.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. And the only thing that kind of differs him from some of those receivers that you mentioned is he's that home run hitter. He's the Deshaun Jackson type guy that needs to get over the top and get that big play to really come through for dynasty owners. And if he is dropping those passes, he just can't do that for you. Austin, do you have any other thoughts on Fuller down there in Houston?
I thought you hit the nail on the head there, Dan, with what you just said. He's, such a kind of a boom or bust player that if he's only going to get, 5 targets a game, drop those targets, especially quarterback, maybe 2 or 3 of those catchable targets. And if he's dropping one, it's going to be a killer for you in fantasy. But the situation is just so bad in Houston. I'm sure they're going to try to change things up at quarterback this offseason, but hard for them to support 2 receivers. And, Hopkins is going to get his. And Fedorovitz came along. He was actually their number 2 option. Yeah. I think Matt said the ADP was wide receiver 37. You can never really rule anybody out and say, I'm never going to have this guy, but it's relative. So at this price, I wouldn't want any of them, but that if he next year, his price will probably drop to the point where I'm interested if he's, falls outside the top 50 receivers.
Yeah, those are good points. Just to take a break here for a second, guys, is Austin kind of choppy on your end, Matt? Or are you hearing him?
A little bit. It's a little bit choppy. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have anything that might help us out on that, Austin?
No, I can try to go sit closer to my router. Maybe
okay,
help.
let's try that. Let's try that for a minute. It's all right. We'll just kind of move on, and if she has to edit, Aaron, if you have to edit that out, just cut Austin. He's just a guest anyway. Okay. And we're going to be back into it here in just a second. Another thing that caught my eye, or probably caught everybody's eye this past weekend, was Tony Romo, not obviously for his play on the field, but everything coming out of Dallas after the game, that he's probably thrown his last pass for the Cowboys. Denver seems to be the favorite potential landing spot among most dynasty owners. Austin, I'll go to you first this time. Are you on board with everybody kind of being excited about Romo ending up being a Bronco, or would you like to see him maybe land somewhere else?
I think Denver seems like it'd be a pretty good fit, just fantasy perspective. They have 2 good receivers, and I think C.J. Anderson's a really good running back, so that'd be a pretty good spot for him. Yeah, selfishly, I think I'd kind of like to see him go to the Bears. I know that's not what either of you want to hear, but yeah, I just think from a real life perspective, the Bears have some things going, and they could they have some decent young players, and maybe somebody like Romo can come in there and they could maybe challenge for a playoff spot. But from a fantasy perspective, it's hard to come up with a better situation than Denver would be for him.
Yeah, I think most dynasty owners would agree. And the ties that he has to the Chicago area might point him in the direction of the Bears at some point. Matt, what do you think? Where would you like to see Tony Romo flinging passes next season?
I mean, I think Denver would be great, but I think they released I mean, who knows if it's true at this point in the offseason, but I do think they said that they weren't going to trade for him. I think a lot of it is that salary that's going to come with him. But if he doesn't go there, I agree. The Bears is a great landing spot. It just seems like a team for him. If they bring Alshon back, he's got 2 receivers there. He's got a running back in place. And, it seems like a guy that John Fox would like he would be a John Fox kind of quarterback. If it's not the Bears, I think the Jets and Dolphins are interesting. And the Texans, I think, are even interested too. Not that they're really going to pay 2 quarterbacks probably that much money, but it would be interesting to see if he did stay in state. I mean, I think they would be, they might still be in the playoffs if Roma was their quarterback with that defense.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Houston is kind of that back burner one for me too. I'd really like to see him play with Nuke and those other weapons that they have down there in Houston. So let's kind of get to the main part of our podcast this week. Matt and I thought it would be, with all the new leagues that are sure to pop up this off season, we'd talk a little bit about startup strategy. Let's start with some relatively general startup strategies that we like to use. For instance, fellas, and Austin will be a good one to talk to you about this one. First of all, is your number one strategy going into a startup trying to win a championship in year one, or do you have something else in mind when you kind of show up for that startup?
I'm always trying to contend right away. I think I just couldn't go about it any other way. Like if, I know some people like to punt the first year or whatever you want to call it, but to me, they're just hoping to contend, in like 2020 or 2021, when I would just rather contend right now and then worry about that later. So yeah, for me, I'm always trying to kind of look at things in like 2 or 3 year windows. So I want to draft a team, or at least leave the draft with the team I think is like going to be a playoff team in year one.
Yeah, and that worked out great for you in Bustapalooza. Like I said before, you came out on top in that one. I kind of agree with you. I don't like to play fantasy football and not win, or at least try to win. So I always want to win in year one. And so, that just kind of makes a year one title my primary objective. How about you, Matt? Is that kind of how you lean, or do you like to build for the long game?
Yeah, in general, I try to win year one, mostly because I think it's the easiest year to win, because, you have at least 2 or 3, sometimes as many as 4 or 5 or 6 teams, doing that productive struggle, trying to punt year one and building a true juggernaut down the road. So for me, like with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 teams out of it, right away, then it seems like that's the easiest year to win for me. So I'm usually going for that. That said, I will build with productive youth and a lot of veterans. I like to kind of diversify my team a bit. I guess I feel like you can reload rather than rebuild all the time. I've only have a couple of teams in my entire 20 years of playing this game where I've considered full rebuilds and not reloads. So, coming out of the draft the first year, competing for a playoff spot at a minimum is definitely a priority of mine.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about what you just said, the productive youth. That's something that you hear talked about a lot on Twitter. People like to talk about it and try to point you or point other dynasty owners in the direction of productive youth. But let's shine a light on it a little bit. You both said you like to try to win early as this kind of startup rolls out. Matt, talk a little bit more about the productive youth, how you mix that with the veterans and the young players that maybe might not be as productive right away. What are your goals when you get into that startup as far as trying to pinpoint those productive young players rather than those guys that need a year or two to kind of simmer?
Yeah, for me, it's just, I want as little unknown as possible in the early rounds. I want my first, at least two of my first 3 picks to hit pretty good, so I want a guy, you can get young guys like Mike Evans or Odell Beckham or Nuke Hopkins, those kind of guys that we know that are going to be, that are both have a good combination of both youth and a history of production on them. Whereas, a lot of guys will start taking the rookies in the second round, and I'm not really willing to invest a pick that high in somebody who I've never seen play an NFL snap. So, early on, I'm trying to get those young guys that also have a track record. In the middle rounds, I'm building around, the veterans, the guys that fall, that, people have been saying that Larry Fitzgerald is going to retire for the last 3 years, but if you've had him the last 3 years, you've probably been doing pretty good on your fantasy team. So, in those middle rounds, that's where I like to grab those. And then at the end are where I like to take my shots on those youth, those rookies that I haven't seen a snap yet. You can still find guys at the end of your draft that of your startup draft that are both young, they're rookies, they haven't had a chance to show you what they do, that have upside, that are going to increase in value. I just feel like early on in the draft, I'd rather guarantee and lock into some production. And obviously in the first few rounds, hopefully they're young also.
Yeah, and Austin, I'm guessing you would agree with most of what Matt is saying. I'm looking at your Bustapalooza roster, that championship roster, full of a lot of those kind of guys, those names, veteran guys, but have a little bit of youth. You have Julio Jones on that team, T.Y. Hilton, a few other veterans, Le'Veon Bell's on that team as well. Talk a little bit about how you like to build at the beginning of your either startup draft or auction, and how you try to find that productive youth.
Man, if I was in the draft with Matt, we would be going after a lot of the same people. I think just everything he said there, I was just nodding my head like, yes, preach, like this is what I'm talking about. Yeah, I absolutely hate taking risks early in a startup draft. I feel like if you get to pick from this whole pool of NFL players, how could you take someone in the first 20 picks and that player not be really good for you right away? Like, not even just right away, like those first 3 or 4 years, barring injury, like there's no way you should have someone flop. Now, obviously it happens, but yeah, so for me, I'm going receivers. I don't want to get too far into this. I know we're going to cover it here in a bit, but yeah, I'm going receivers. I'm going as much as I can, sure things with my first 3 or 4 picks. And then what Matt said, I'm kind of going to go veterans, guys that are proven that, I feel like I know what I'm going to get from them. And then in the back half of the draft is when I'm willing to take some shots on younger guys, rookies, first or second year guys that haven't quite done it yet. But yeah, that's just kind of how I like to do things. I just couldn't handle spending an early round, just making an early round investment on a player that I wasn't sure if he was going to be any good or not. I just couldn't do that.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. We kind of all share a brain on how to build and how to find those productive players, especially early in these drafts, or if you're spending a lot of money in an auction. Let's talk about a couple other general philosophies. And you touched on this a little bit, Austin, that you like to go after wide receivers early. How about you, Matt? Are you in the same camp? Do you like to snatch up a few of those wideouts, or is there another position that you like to build around and spend a majority of your draft or auction equity in to build your roster?
Yeah, it obviously depends a little bit on format, but in a standard 1 quarterback, 3 receiver, 2 running back league, then yeah, I'm definitely building around wide receivers there. I don't really need to explain this to you guys. You guys are all experienced dynasty owners, but they produce the most consistent for the longest period of time. So I'm still willing to build around those guys early. I'm probably not even thinking about taking a running back, I don't know, till like the 5th or 6th round at the earliest. I think this year is going to be really fun for startups for people that do build around wide receivers, because this was the year of the running back. So coming into 2017, I think there's going to be 3, 4 guys, go in the top first, probably 3 guys in the first round, and maybe Gurley again in the second. So, I think it's going to be a really good year for us in startups for those that build around wide receivers.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on each position a little later in the podcast. We'll talk about how we attack each position in a startup. Austin, is there anything? Excuse me, I lost my spot here. Austin, Matt touched a little bit on how the scoring rules may affect how he walks into a startup and how he comes up with his strategy. Are there any rules that you like to look at and that might alter the way you build your roster in your startups?
If it's PPR, then there's a certain type of running back like a Bernard or those patch catching guys, Dion Lewis or whatever, that's the kind of guy I'm going to try to get on my roster, because I'm probably not going to take a running back 5 or 6 rounds. You never know how a draft will work out, but for the most part, I'm probably going to go with receivers in my first handful of picks. And PPR just helps those running backs that don't get a lot of carries, score some more points. And sometimes they can be a little more consistent week to week than just like a guy who relies on carries. Go ahead.
I'm going to be sure not to join leagues with you two, because it sounds like the three of us would just battle for the same players. But moving on a little bit, one big factor that affects strategy is whether you're doing a traditional draft or if you're participating in an auction. Let's talk a little bit about each of these. Matt, first, do you prefer a draft, or would you rather do the auction format when you're in a startup?
I will not do a snake startup anymore. I did one last year in a best ball format league, but for the most part, I want to be able to build the team how I want to build it. So an auction is number one for me first. If I get invited to a new league and it's a snake draft, at this point, I have so many leagues, I will generally turn it down. So an auction is definitely the first thing I'm looking for when I'm joining a new startup.
Austin, how about you? What do you prefer? Would you rather do the auction like Matt, or do you like to draft?
I like auctions a lot. I think it just takes a lot more work and investment of time on your part to prepare for it. There's so much safety in a snake draft. I'm getting a pick every X number of picks, like I get a player. But in an auction draft, it doesn't work like that. You can sit on your hands for 10 minutes and realize, oh my God, my roster's empty. I got to start spending money. And I just think that's really fun. And kind of what Matt touched on, where, you can get your players. Like there's no, oh, I have the 10th spot in the draft. Here's 6 guys I know I'm not getting. Like you have a shot at every player and you can do whatever you want to do. And I think that makes it really fun.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. And since all of us like auctions so much, let's save that one for later, and let's talk about drafts. Obviously, all of us have participated in them, even if we haven't recently, because we prefer auctions. Let's talk a little bit about that preparation that you talked about before, Austin. How do you like to prepare for a draft? Are there specific steps you like to take to get ready for it? And are there any tips or tricks that make for a successful startup in your eyes?
I usually like to have either with me or pulled up online somewhere the ADP from DLF. That's a pretty good barometer that, every draft is its own entity, but for the most part, that our ADP is a pretty good barometer of what things are going to shake out like. And in startups, I'm really adamant about trying to get the guys I want. So if that means reaching a little bit, I'll do it. And it kind of depends in a snake draft. If you're at the end of a round, you kind of need to maybe reach and get your guy if you're not picking for 15 more picks. But in an auction, maybe it's just spending a couple more dollars to get a guy. But yeah, I have my guys, and that's probably like my biggest fault is if I don't get them in the draft, I'm going to try really hard to trade for them. But I just have certain guys that I want, and that I just kind of have my mindset that I want to get those guys.
Matt, you have any other thoughts other than getting the guy you want and using DLF's ADP to kind of build your, or at least look at while you do those startup drafts?
Yeah, we preach this a lot, but first and foremost, I'm just going to say, know your rule set. Is it points per carry? Is it super flex? Is it tight end premium? Make sure you know those things, of course. And then I'm a big proponent of tier-based drafting. So I create tiers first, usually based on my own rankings or somebody's consistent consensus rankings that I trust. So I build them that way. And then, I generally do have a strategy going in, but it's especially in a snake format, I feel like it's important to be flexible. So I like to, if there's a guy that I want and I feel like I have to reach for him, I'll try to trade back first or something like that, so I'm going to be bouncing around that draft quite a bit. So I'm kind of looking, I'm like Austin, once I know my draft position, I'm looking at ADP, I'm looking at my tiers and where I think those guys are going to fall. myself to get those guys either, a little bit earlier than their average draft positions, just to make sure that I can get them.
Yeah, I do a lot of the same stuff you guys are talking about. ADP, if you have to reach a couple spots to get the guy you want, knowing your rules is a huge one. And of course, I like to do the tier-based drafting as well, just like you do, Matt. I'd also like to add to that I like to keep track of all the other rosters when the auction is going on. It just helps you make that decision sometimes, especially if you're towards the front or the back of a round when it's about to flip. If you know that those guys are stacked at quarterback and you're looking for one, it can help you make that decision. I can grab the wide receiver now because that quarterback's going to make the turn to me. So all good advice, fellas. You touched on it a little bit, Matt, but I'd like to know where you guys, if you do have a preference, where you like to draft. Would you like to be early in the first, middle, so you kind of come around in the middle of every round, or do you like to be in the late first round so you get that second guy earlier? Matt, what do you think? Where would you like to draft preferably?
It depends on if there's trading allowed. So like if it's a typical redraft league, I do like to be at the ends. I like to start runs, rather than being caught on them. So I like to take like a back-to-back receivers or back-to-back quarterbacks or whatever it is at the turn. But if it's on a dynasty draft where I can trade around, I don't mind as much where I am, but it does seem like it's easier for me if I'm in the middle to like kind of hop around more, just because there's only a maximum, a half a round distance between my pick and any other owner's pick. So it makes it a little bit easier to come up with trades that work for both owners. And whereas, if you're picking at the early part of the round, another guy's picking at the late end of the round, there's just a big swing when you're trading picks back and forth. So I do think it's a little bit easier from the middle from that perspective.
Yeah, I kind of agree. Austin, in Bustapalooza, you had the third pick. You drew the number 3 pick and picked Julio Jones with that selection. Is that where you like to be, or were you able to turn where you don't like to be in a draft into a winning roster?
Yeah, I actually would prefer to pick toward the end of the first round in a snake draft. Especially this year, looking at the ADP, I feel like there's a real solid group of 15 or 16 players. And if you're picking, toward the tail end of the first round, you're going to get 2 of those guys, hopefully. Whereas if you're picking early, you're going to get stuck with, maybe a player who I don't necessarily love, like when you start getting into the Jordan Matthews, Moncrief, Parker range. Like, yeah, that's part of the reason I love auctions so much, is that you're never on the clock and you have to pick from a list of 10 of the best guys available, and you don't really like any of those guys. So in a snake, and I did this in Bustapalooza, and I got pretty lucky, but I just picked some guys who I thought had a lot of value in other people's eyes, just planning on trading them. I just kind of the take and trade method, and it worked out. But yeah, normally I would rather pick at the end of the draft because I feel like you kind of almost guaranteed to get 2 really good players.
So it sounds like you pretty much made an adjustment on the fly in Bustapalooza, Austin, where there wasn't a guy you necessarily liked to keep on your roster, but you took somebody that could get you some value somewhere else down the road. Are there any other tips or tricks you use as the draft progresses that our listeners might be able to use to their advantage as they enter these startups this offseason?
I think kind of what Matt said, you have to stay flexible. If you're too rigid in your approach, it's probably going to backfire on you. You never really know how a draft is going to go. So you just kind of have to go with the ebbs and the flows a little bit. Yeah, for me, in a 1 quarterback league, just a standard format, I'm not going to take a quarterback or a tight end like probably in the first half of the draft. I just wouldn't mess with it. I think quarterback's deep enough that you can get some serviceable guys later. Same at tight end. If you're not, getting, I would have normally said Gronk or, Reed or Eifert. Even the top guys aren't that reliable. I just think I would rather just wait, take somebody like Ertz later and just go from there. The positions where you just have to start one guy, I just don't put a lot of stock in those spots.
Matt, is there any other adjustments other than what Austin kind of talked about there, that you like to make in the middle, or you look to make in the middle of a startup draft?
Yeah, I just going back to the flexibility thing. Like I also echo Austin's sentiments that I probably am not taking a quarterback or a tight end, in the first half of the draft. But things change. I've seen like if Aaron Rodgers slips to the 5th or 6th round, I may pull the trigger on him. That kind of thing. So I think you still have to be flexible. If you don't want to take running backs if you're going 0 RB, but David Johnson is sitting there at the end of the 2nd round for some reason. You have to be able to flip a switch and go in a different direction when you need to. So just in terms of like basic adjustments, just what I was talking about earlier in terms of taking youth and production early, veterans and solid production in the middle, and then towards the end of the draft is where I'm looking for those unproven young guys.
Yeah, me too. I couldn't agree with you guys more. We all kind of share in a brain. Let's flip over to auction here for a few minutes. I'd like to get your guys' thoughts on if there's anything you do differently when you're preparing in an auction rather than in a draft. Matt, is there something specific that you like to do to get ready for that auction?
There's so much different between an auction and a snake draft for me. First and foremost, I'm setting up my budget. And we won't get too deep into this now because I know we're going to do an in-depth auction episode. But especially from people that have never never done an auction draft before and are coming strictly from snake drafts, an easy way to do it is to set your budget up per round. So say the first round is obviously going to be your most valuable player. So for example, for me, I like to, for my first round pick, quote unquote first round pick, I'll spend anywhere from 20 to 25% on my first round pick. If I want an elite guy like Odell Beckham, I'll go up to 25, 26%. And then I kind of just grade those down as we go down the rounds. And then for me, every player after say the 10th or 11th round is a $1 or 1% guy for me. So I kind of spend top heavy on my starters first. So I organize my budget that way. So I have a spreadsheet open. I'm tracking all of the salaries and everything that's going through. I'm creating an entry for each of my, top 100, top 120 players or so. And go from there. So there's a lot more that goes into it. And I don't want to get too in depth here, but we'll get into the nitty gritty stuff later. But setting up a budget and then tiers are even more important in an auction because you really got to know when that last guy in a tier is coming off the board. Generally, those last guys in a tier end up costing as much as the guys that come off first in the tier. So those tiers are really important for auctions for me.
Man, you just hit us with a lot of knowledge there. All stuff, I love auctions and all stuff that I definitely do. The biggest things you said there was set up a budget. I like to do it actually by your starting lineup. I like to actually put dollar amounts next to each spot in a starting lineup and the bench, but it's real similar to what you're talking about there, Matt. I also agree with you 100% on the 25% on your top guy. I'm a stickler to that. I regularly go as high as 25%. And then the last thing you said about the spreadsheet, just the biggest part of my auction preparation. I got to know what this stuff is, what these guys are going for on a whim, so I know exactly how much I should be spending, and if there are other players in that tier that will go for more or less based on how many are left in the tier. So let's flip it over to Austin here. You're an auction guy as well. I want to know, is there something else that you do that's different than your draft prep, or did Matt pretty much hit on everything?
Yeah, both of you guys hit on a lot of it. That was a lot of fun to listen to. For me, Dan, this is something you touched on earlier, but I think in an auction, it's really imperative to know what the other guys have on their roster, the other players in the league. And, usually you're going to find yourself, when you're bidding for a player and it gets down toward the end, you're probably just bidding against one or two other guys. So you need to know, what do they have? Is this guy as desperate for this? Is he really need this guy? Have you talked about 25%. Well, maybe it's past that. And man, this guy does not have any receivers. Like, he has to get this guy, and you could make him spend a couple more bucks just by bidding it up. And then I think also you just kind of have to be on your game the entire draft, which for a snake draft, that's not true. You make your pick, you can kind of just check out for a couple minutes. Oh, I'm in the hole, I'm up. In an auction, it ceases to amaze me, how surprising it is when the good value happens. You don't know when it's going to happen. It could be the third player nominated. I think early in auctions, everyone's jacked up to get, the superstar players, but inevitably someone's going to throw out like Frank Gore, nominate him in the first 5 minutes, and maybe he just goes for, absurdly cheap because everyone's just bored and they don't really want to bid on him. Or and sometimes it's the opposite. The market hasn't really been set in the draft, and T.Y. Hilton or someone goes for a lot cheaper than they should. You look back 10 minutes later and you think, dang, I should have bid more on T.Y. Hilton. He was a pretty good deal. So I think just knowing what the other guys in the draft need when you're bidding, and just always being ready, always be paying attention, because you never really know when the steal of the draft's about to happen.
Yeah, you make some great points there, Austin. I've always thought that a draft is like playing checkers and an auction is like playing chess. It just takes a little bit more savvy player and somebody that really wants to get a little bit more in depth. When people kind of half-ass it, you can tell when their roster construction comes out at the end. So Matt said earlier that he likes to spend on his starters. He doesn't mind spending a lot of money to get that stud or the 2 or 3 studs and get them on their roster. How about you, Austin? Do you like to spread the money around, or are you kind of a studs and duds, or what I like to call a studs and bargains type of? Do you take that kind of approach?
This is something that kind of I waver on sometimes. I don't really have like a set in stone strategy. In a dynasty startup, I think it's kind of foolish to let a couple bucks be the difference between you getting, an Odell or a Julio, a cornerstone guy, but to let $2 or $3 be the difference between you getting them and you not getting them. If you're going to spend 45, just go ahead and spend 48 and just get them. You got your guy for theoretically as long as you want to have him. But I always find myself in drafts really falling in love with guys in the back half of drafts in a snake draft. So in an auction, I really like to have, and so I can be one of the bigger guys that can bully people that, only have $1 and are nominating and just hope they get through. Maybe I can get a couple of those late round, so to speak, type of guys that I really want. So just trying to save up a couple bucks at the end to get those guys. I know that kind of doesn't mesh well with what I just said about spending up to get the stud you want, but I think that's what makes the auction draft so much fun, is that there's so many things that go into it. And you kind of can't really have everything you want all at once. But yeah, I would like to have some money, the last 10 minutes of the draft to kind of handpick a couple of guys that I'd like to get.
Yeah, I agree completely. And you made sense to me, because if you do what we talked about earlier with the budget and things like that, and you set it up correctly, it's really easy to adjust those extra $2 to $3 that you had to spend to get that cornerstone guy like Julio or Odell. Matt, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I do like the stars and scrubs, or studs and duds, whatever strategy you want to call it. I do like that approach quite a bit. But I usually don't really decide on what I'm going to do until I've seen maybe the first 5 or 10 players have gone off the board. Because I think if you have your spreadsheet set up correctly, if you have your budget set up, if you have, your projected value for, the top 100 or so players, then it's going to become pretty easy to see who's going for too much. If the first 5 to 10 players coming off are, they're all under your projected values, and I like to jump in, and before everybody starts to loosen up their purse strings a little bit, get a couple studs early if they're being penny pinchers. And then that extra money, it's likely to drive up the prices and the players in the middle of the auction. So then those owners realize, hey, I have more money left, and there's actually value left on the board. So then they're in that spot. But on the other hand, if those 5 or 10 players are all over the projected values, then I'll sit back, and eventually those guys are going to stop firing, and something's going to come through. And then, like Austin was talking, like at the end, especially in that scenario where people are going hard and heavy to begin with, and you can sit back and scoop some value. Then at the end, you have maybe $10 left out of a $100 budget, while everybody else has $5, and you can spend $2 to get your guys at the end and just basically control the auction at the end of it. So that's really nice talk there from Austin.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I like a lot of what you just said as well, Matt. I think the biggest thing that we come out of this conversation is the flexibility in these auctions that you have to keep. You might say, oh, I really want to see what the market says. But when all of a sudden you're looking at AJ Green or Amari Cooper or Julio Jones, and it really feels like they should be going for 5% more, and then later on Demaryius Thomas goes for just as much as them, you're going to be kicking yourself. So you have to be flexible. You have to be willing to make an adjustment on the fly. Last thing I want to talk to you guys about auction philosophy or strategy. Two-part question, and Matt, you kind of touched on this. Do you like to spend early, or do you like to wait and see how the spending goes in an ideal world, I guess, in a vacuum, where players are going for what they should go for? Would you rather spend early or wait and see? And then also, Austin, do you like to nominate players that you intend on bidding on, or do you like to get some of that money off the books, nominate guys that you're hoping people overspend on?
Yeah, for me, I usually like to sit back and just kind of get my feel and see how things are going. Like Matt said, if there's deals to be had early, then you got to get in and be active and get those deals. But most of the time, in my experience at least, I think guys go for too much early, and I just kind of sit back, and then I'll nominate players that I don't want, like a Rob Gronkowski, and just let somebody spend money on them. And then toward the later part of the draft, maybe if there's a couple guys, like maybe I'll nominate one of those guys, and if he goes for what I think is too much, that's fine. At least I know, and I can adjust my draft from there and target the couple other guys I want. But I'm sitting back and I'm nominating guys that I don't really have interest in, and watching other people's budgets drop.
How about you, Matt? Do you do a lot of the same thing? I know I do.
Yeah, I almost never nominate a player that I want. I just almost never do it. I mean, occasionally I'll throw one in there that I do actually want, but for the most part, I want to get everybody else's money out of their pocket. So I want all of the players that I don't want on the board as soon as possible. So yeah, I definitely do a lot of this stuff. Another thing I like to do is if I have a bunch of wide receivers already on my team, then I'll just keep nominating wide receivers. Another thing you can do is, if say like Le'Veon Bell goes up, and now right away I'm going to nominate D'Angelo Williams and make that guy that just bought Le'Veon Bell, make sure he feels like he has to get that handcuff too right away. So, there's all kinds of little tricks like that you can throw in the way you nominate players.
Yeah, one more that I'd like to kind of pass along that I like to do is nominate a similar player to what just went. For example, if Zach Ertz just went for what I think is way too much, I might, if it's my nomination, I might as well throw out another tight end, similar tiered guy, especially if I already got a guy, and watch that money fly off the board. Excellent stuff from both of you so far. We're going to take just a minute. When we come back, we'll talk about each position, strategy by position, and how we attack every position in a starting lineup going into a startup draft or auction. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the DLF Dynasty podcast. I am Dan Myler, your host this week on the pod. I am joined by Matt Price and our excellent guest who really knows his stuff, Austin Cass. You guys, we've talked a lot about helpful tips and tricks, the adjustments that you make in a draft or an auction, but let's get down to the bare bones of things, and let's talk about each position, how you attack the position when you're building that roster in a startup. We'll start under center, of course. Let's start with quarterback, and we'll kind of break this down into two categories. We'll do single quarterback leagues and then two quarterback and super flex leagues. Let's start with those single QB leagues. Austin, how do you like to attack the quarterback position? Do you like to target a stud, or would you rather have patience and find one of those values later on in a draft, or one of those cheap guys in an auction?
for the most part, I like to wait and draft quarterbacks in the middle to late rounds. If there's an instance where Aaron Rodgers was there in like the 6th or 7th round, then maybe that would change my mind. But for the most part, I'm going to sit back and wait. And actually, I think with the way the ADP looks right now, that actually fits my strategy really well as far as trying to win early, because Brady and Breeze are QBs 11 and 12 right now. So if you can get somebody like that who, sure, they're not going to give you, 5 years of production probably, but probably going to give you 1 or 2 years of being a top 5 quarterback. That's a perfect guy for me. And then getting somebody later like an Alex Smith or a Flacco, I usually have a lot of shares of those guys just because they're boring, they're cheap, and they have a guaranteed starting job. So if in a pinch, a bye week or someone gets hurt, or maybe my QB1 has a terrible matchup, I can throw those guys in and roll the dice with them. But for the most part, I'm sitting and just taking a quarterback later, and I'm not really putting too much thought or investment in the position.
Yeah, the thing that you said, the names that you mentioned, Brady and Breeze, those values, those are the guys I like to target as well. How about you, Matt? Do you do anything different?
At some point, we're going to find something we disagree on, but it's not this one. Yeah, I mean, when you can get Brady or Breeze or Roethlisberger, in the 10th, 11th, 12th round, why am I going to spend an early pick? It just makes no sense. If I want to wait later, I can get, Phillip Rivers is going off the board in the 13th or 14th right now. He's a QB 18 on this month's ADP. If I want to go even deeper, I can get Romo in the 20th round. I mean, it's just, you could just keep going. And we're at the point now in 1 quarterback leagues where you can basically wait until the last pick of your draft almost to take a quarterback. You can stream, you can offer up a 2nd round pick and get almost any, quarterback in the 8 to 15 range, So I see little reason to invest in the position in a 1 quarterback league at this point.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I like to have as much patience as possible and target those veterans. I also like to kind of pair that guy. I like to have a 2nd quarterback in the roster, even in 1 quarterback leagues. But I like to have one of those young guys. How about you guys? Matt, do you like to pair the veteran with a real young guy? And how many quarterbacks do you like to have on your roster in single quarterback leagues?
Yeah, in a single quarterback league, I'm probably only drafting 1, honestly, maybe 2. And if I do draft the 2nd one, it's going to be one of those, those later round rookies that aren't getting as much pub. For example, Dak Prescott this year, or some other kind of like prospect towards the end, like a Tyrod Taylor, maybe I don't know, like a Tannehill or something. But you want some, at least for me, I want some upside with that 2nd guy, somebody that could turn into something. A lot of guys like to have 3, they have their starter. They like to have a guy who's reliable backup if their starter goes down, and they have their 3rd guy for that developmental spot. But for me, I usually don't spend more than two roster spots in a 1 quarterback league on quarterbacks.
Yeah, I don't either. Tyrod Taylor, interesting that you said his name. He's kind of one of the guys over the last couple of years that I've targeted as that 2nd guy. And he never really panned out to really hit it big, but he always filled in relatively well when I needed him in a pinch. So let's flip over to 2 quarterback and super flex leagues. That's the format that we play in Bustapalooza, Austin. And of course, you are our champion in that. I can't. Austin paid me a lot of money to mention it over and over and over again, so I'll continue to do it. That's a super flex league. Austin, are you one of the guys that like to target a quarterback early? I know you didn't necessarily in that one, especially, at least not in the 1st round. What's typically your philosophy when attacking the quarterback position in super flex leagues?
I still like to wait. Just by nature of the league, you can't wait as long as you would in a 1 quarterback league, but I like to get 2 of those guys ranked in the teens, like a Dalton and a Rivers or something. I was saying that in the Bustapalooza draft, I took Rodgers in the 2nd round. I believe it was – I had the 3rd pick. So, yeah, I got him at the end of the 2nd round. And that just because there wasn't anybody there that I loved, and I thought – it's a 2 quarterback league. This will be nice to have Aaron Rodgers on my team. It was nice. It was fun. It was really fun. But yeah, I think just by the way the league's constructed, you have to have, a little more emphasis on the quarterback spot. And I'm probably, I agree with what Matt said about standard leagues. I don't want to waste roster spots on backup quarterbacks and stuff. But in that league, I'd like to have probably two solid locked-in starters, and then maybe like a Cody Kessler or somebody like that flyer on them late, depending how deep the league is and how deep rosters are. But I'm going to be waiting to try and get two guys in the teens in that format.
Matt, are you doing this a lot of the same thing? Are you targeting, are you trying to wait a few rounds to get that first quarterback? And how many quarterbacks do you like to have rostered in a super flex league?
I go back and forth on this one. For auctions, for some reason, it just tends to work out that I get two of those guys like Austin was talking about in the teens. But I do like to have two studs there, especially in like a snake format. The thing that I like to throw out there is that it doesn't really feel that good to spend a late first or early second round pick on a guy like, Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson or Cam Newton, whatever your favorite flavor is. But it feels a lot worse to spend a fifth or sixth round pick on a guy like Ryan Tannehill or Joe Flacco. So especially in a snake format, I want to try to lock in at least one stud, if not two. In auctions, I feel like I'm a little bit better at finding value in those deeper guys. I started off a couple of startups this year with guys like Rivers and Roethlisberger, or, I have a lot of Rivers. So Rivers and, a Flacco or something like that, a Stafford, a Dalton, something like that. But I really do prefer to have two guys that I know have the potential to put up 25, 30-point games every week, because it's just such a huge advantage there. You can win a super flex or two quarterback league with only one good quarterback or one average quarterback, but it's just a heck of a lot harder to do it. So I try to lock in at least one stud to be like an anchor. And if I can get a second one for a decent value, then I'll do that too.
Yeah, Austin certainly did that by getting Rodgers. He helped him, carried him really down the stretch to get that Bustapalooza title. That's the last one, right, Austin? That's the last time I got to mention that you're the champ.
Bring it up. That's fine with me.
Let's talk a little bit about the running back position. We're going to rip through these pretty quickly. Matt, how about running backs? Do you like to lock up that number one guy? And does the success of the position in 2016, I know you kind of touched on this before, does that make you more willing to build around running backs going forward than maybe you were in the past?
I feel like this is kind of cliche at this point, but for me, it's those top three guys, David Johnson, Ezekiel Elliott, and Le'Veon Bell. If I can get one of those guys towards the end of the first round, if there's 7 or 8 receivers in my top tier off the board, then I'm definitely grabbing one of those guys. But I'm starting to see them creep up in ADP. They're going, David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell, Ezekiel, those guys are going the top 5, 6 picks now in some formats, just after OBJ and Mike Evans. So in that case, I'm still waiting. I do think, as I mentioned earlier, that this was kind of the year of the running back. And for us that like to build around wide receiver, that's going to be really good to start up this year. So I do tend to wait generally on my running backs. And especially if I'm not getting one of those top 3 guys, then the rest of them I'll just throw a couple names in the hats and grab them when I need, especially early on in the process. If we're doing our startups early, like we are now, February, March, April, I'm not really worried about roster construction yet. So if I don't have a running back on my roster yet that I feel comfortable with, then I just started to address that as we get closer to the playing season.
Austin, I see you nodding your head to a lot of that, so I imagine you agree. I'd like to know from you, Austin, I'm one of those guys that like to go after those veterans because, like I said before, I do a lot of auctions, and it seems like I can get some value on those guys in their late 20s, guys like DeMarco Murray or Shady McCoy. Austin, do you kind of target those same types of running backs?
Yeah, for sure. I had a lot of Frank Gore last year. He was someone I thought is just really cheap, and he's locked into volume. Like, that's really all I'm looking for back there, is that someone just has like a pulse and they're going to get like 15 touches a game. I really hard time with the volatility of the position. Invest in an early round pick and a running back. like Matt said, drafts can be different. Somebody falls to you like Johnson, Zeke, or Bell. For me, it would probably have to be the second round for me to like seriously think about taking them. And even then, I don't know if I could. And the success the running backs had this year actually makes me even more excited to do receivers early, because you can probably get 2 really good receivers with your first 2 picks with the way running backs are going. I think like Jay Ajayi, he's going in like the 3rd round right now. And like, it's crazy that to me that people will invest a lot in these running backs that, really don't have much of a track record at all. And even though Ajayi was great this year, but yeah, I would just much rather have a receiver.
Yeah, I kind of agree with most of what you guys are saying. And you mentioned that you mentioned Gore as kind of a value. He wasn't cheap. He was pretty much free this year, and he helped a lot of people, especially early in the season. Let's pivot over to the wide receiver position. I think the 3 of us are probably in agreement that it's the most important position in our minds when looking at roster construction in a startup. Matt, let's start with you. You kind of talked about it earlier. You like to lock up that wide receiver 1, get that stud guy. Are you sometimes looking to get 2 of those guys if you can, even 3? And how many wide receivers are too many to start your startup?
Oh, for sure. If I can get 2, I'm getting 2. If I can get 3, I'm getting 3. I'm getting as many of those, top tier receivers as I can. If it means trading up a little bit, then if I see a guy drop, towards the bottom of the tier and he's still sitting there, then I'll trade up to grab him. In terms of how many, it really depends, I guess, on how big your roster is. I don't mind spending 10 roster spots in a typical, 20, 25, 30 roster spot dynasty league, easily 10 plus. So yeah, as long as I've got my other positions starters covered, then I'm happy to take wide receivers for every other roster spot.
Austin, you like the receivers as well. Is there too many for you? Can you go 3 or 4 deep to start your startup?
Yeah, that would be fine with me. Like Matt said, as many of those, wide receiver 1, top 10, 15 guys as I can get, like I want to get those guys. And then, yeah, even guys like Baldwin, 24th receiver, Tyrell Williams is somebody I really like. He's a 31st receiver. Edelman, the 40th receiver. Like, I just really like receivers, and I feel so good about them when I draft them. And it's just, I think it's a lot easier to make that investment for me. And I kind of like what Matt said. I'll get as many of them as I can.
You sound like you got a little bit of a problem there, Austin. Like you might need to talk to somebody about it.
I know, yeah. I was just scrolling down the ADP as I was rattling those guys off, and I thought, like, I can't just name all of these players. Like, I have to find one I don't like.
It's a safe space here. It's a safe space.
Yeah, your face just lit up. I could see you scrolling. We're in a Google Hangout here, and I think Austin just went freaky over the wide receiver list in the ADP on DLF. So let's stop talking about receivers since Austin's getting a little too excited. We're going to talk about a position he doesn't like so much, and that's tight end. I am a fan of having Rob Gronkowski on my roster, guys. I like to pay for him, and I play in a lot of tight end premium leagues, so maybe that skews things just a little bit. You guys talk me out of spending big auction money on Rob Gronkowski in a tight end premium league. Matt, are you willing to try to talk me out of it?
I don't know. I do feel like the gap has closed between Gronk and the rest of the field, those top 5 guys or so, to the point where I'm not going to take them at first round value anymore. But in the second round, I have no problem with that. I think there's too many guys that are a little more dependent at a more important position that you can get in the first round to spend that kind of spot on them. But I mean, I can see the argument either way. Gronk is the best tight end of the game, obviously. But, he's got some injuries history. He's got a second back injury. He came in the league with a spinal stenosis injury. So I've always kind of felt like he's going to be one of those guys that, is amazing for a shorter period of time. Like, I don't think he's going to play into his mid to late 30s like Gates and Gonzalez and those guys did. So I guess no, I'm not willing to talk you out of it, but maybe I'm going to hedge and not spend a first round pick, but maybe a second round pick.
Yeah, you're sitting right on top of that fence, and you did a horrible job in talking me out of it. For those in Kitchen Cinco, unless Austin can talk me out of it, I'm going after Gronk. What do you got, Austin?
Well, I'm probably a good guy to try and talk you out of it. I wrote an article for DLF actually that was 4 guys to sell. I just listed one guy at each position, and Gronk was my tight end. It's easy for me to say that because I don't put a lot of stock in the position. Even in tight end premium leagues, all the tight ends, in a TE premium that get, say you get 1.5 points per reception, all the tight ends get that. So it kind of nullifies it and doesn't make like Gronk as big of an advantage. The injury history, what you guys touched on, he's got the injury history of like a running back. Actually, he's got like a worse injury history than like Forte and Gore, and they're like 50-year-old running backs. Eventually, at some point, and with all these back injuries, you would think he's not going to be the same like earth-shattering force that he is. As great as Tom Brady is, he's getting old. At some point, he's going to slow down, and that's going to have to impact Gronk a little bit when that happens. It's crazy to me that Gronk still – his ADP has slipped. It's 22nd overall, so he's out of the first round. But, yeah, I think I just would have a really hard time investing in him at that price. And when you look at any of the tight ends, Reed and Eifert, they've got their injury issues. It's just hard for me to like any of the guys in the top 5. But yeah, specifically with Gronk, yeah, he's just not a guy I would feel great investing a top 15 or so pick in. So if it's a 3rd round, then that's a little more easy to stomach as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, so if you're not willing to take Gronk earlier, and by the way, you didn't talk me out of it either. I love Gronk. If you're not willing to take Gronk early and you don't love those top 5 of the other 4 guys in the top 5, where's the sweet spot for you? What tight end group or tier do you like to target or where? And how many tight ends do you typically like to carry on a roster where you have to start one every week, Austin?
It's very similar to quarterback for me. I'm going to wait and probably, get into the tens or teens and go from there. And maybe during the startup, take 2 guys like a Delaney Walker, Cameron Brate type, or like a Jared Cook who, maybe he's not going to be as cheap, this summer as he would have been if Green Bay didn't make the playoffs. But I'm going to take 2 guys like that. And then during the year, unless, I've got 2 good tight ends by probably just sheer luck, I'm just going to have 1 tight end on the roster. And, a couple weeks before the bye weeks due, try to pick up somebody that has a good matchup that week. But I don't really want to waste another roster spot on a tight end when I could give it to a running back or receiver.
Matt, how about you? Do you like to do the same things? How many tight ends do you like to carry, and where's that sweet spot for you? Where do you like to target the position in a startup?
Yeah, I differ a little bit from Austin. I do like to have one of those top, say, 6 guys, depending on where you're slotting Hunter Henry in there, maybe top 7 guys. I feel like I'm pretty happy getting Olsen or Graham in the 7th or 8th round instead of spending a 1st or 2nd round on Gronk. I'm pretty happy with the production I'm going to get at that point. And they're both, Graham has come on this year, has been more of a consistent player. I didn't really think he was going to come back at all, but he has, and he proved us all wrong. But a guy like Olsen, I will take Olsen in almost every draft. He's 31, but he's a guy that I think is going to play into those mid to late 30s, like Gates or Gonzalez. So in that 5 to 6, 7 range of your tight end rankings, I like to try to get one of those guys at the bottom end, just so that I can have one of those guys that I feel like I don't have to mess with that position at all. And then behind him, I'll take shots on the athletic freak types guys. I like Tyler Higbee. I like Vance McDonald, those guys, those in the roster guys that you can get in the 18th, 19th, 20th round. So I'm going to try to get one of those guys towards the end of that top tier, and then supplement that with some upside guys later.
Well, it took all show, but you guys finally disagreed on something. So, and that's tight end construction of all things. I kind of fall on Matt's side of things. I also like to take, if I don't get Gronk, I like to take that veteran guy and maybe try to get a splash rookie or young player at the position to back him up and hope he hits. So, gosh, I can't say enough. Matt, you dropped so much knowledge. Austin, you dropped so much knowledge on all our listeners. Matt, is there anything you wanted to add before we say goodbye to the listeners?
Yeah, I just wanted to have you compare real quick, if you don't mind, Dan, Gronk and Kelsey. You know, like if you can get Kelsey 2 rounds later, like you still want Gronk over that value there, or are you going to lean more towards Kelsey now, who appears to be the second tight end in ADP now?
Yeah, and I don't want Kelsey. First of all, I love Gronk. If I haven't made that really, really clear, I love Gronk. Give me Gronk every time. But I've been burned by Kelsey so many times, and all the baby Gronk news, I'm just not on board with it. If I miss out on Gronk, I would rather wait, get the guy like Olsen. I can even go a little farther down the list. Some of those guys that Austin was mentioning. Jared Cook seems to be an interesting name to me now. I wouldn't have a problem picking him as my number 1 tight end and then pairing him with another one kind of similar to him. So, if I'm going to spend, I'm going to spend a lot and go get the guy I want. If I'm not going to spend, I'm going to go get those cheap guys and hope I hit on somebody. So that is going to wrap things up. I finally got to do a little bit of analysis, which is usually the role I fill, but this week it was host for sure. Before we wrap things up, I want to remind all our listeners, you can follow Matt Price at mpricer on Twitter. Also follow our excellent guest, Austin. He is at sports_caster. That's sports_caster. You can also follow the DLF Dynasty podcast at DLF Podcast. And if you want to, you can follow me at dmyler22. So that's another DLF Dynasty podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back again next week.
Yay.
I think that went all right, fellas.
All right, everybody. Yeah, the audio got a lot better from Austin, so whatever you did, that worked.
Oh, my gosh.
Good.
Way
I'd moved
better.
like 6 feet in my living room. So.
Yeah, well, it worked, dude. I don't know
found the spot.
Dude, you were awesome. I'm so glad I got a hold of you this morning and you decided you had time tonight. You must be like us and just not have a life, huh?
We just had our second child a couple months ago. So
what?
Okay.
How do you have time for anything?
Yeah, no doubt.
It was nice to have like something to do.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on, dude.
Adults,
no doubt. You did a great job. I'm so glad we had you, and you're a untapped source of knowledge for sure. We're gonna have you on again down the road. Oh,
thanks. Yeah, I felt like I was rambling there, and sometimes I was talking. I was thinking, have I been talking for a while? What am I talking about?
It happens. Man.
Well, we hit time pretty good. We were an hour and 8 minutes, and we're probably gonna have 5 or 6 minutes of edits for sure. And we'll send some notes to Erin that if something's choppy on your end to cut it out, and if she has to cut something out, she could probably cut like the Tony Romo and the early stuff about the Packers maybe if we have to. But So this was my first time since I got you guys. This was my first time hosting. I gotta be blunt and honest. Give me something, maybe something I can improve on. Did I ramble too much? Is there something I can get better at?
I thought you did a good job. I
don't want that. I want give me a negative.
I wish we would have disagreed on more things, so maybe listeners could have some more diverse viewpoints. But from looking at the Bustapalooza draft, I knew you and I, at least from the way that turned out, I knew you and I had a lot of similar philosophies. So it just so happened that Matt kind of fit those too.
Yeah, I've learned. I've been on the pod a few times with Matt now, and he and I share a brain on a lot of stuff. We have very similar philosophies, and
it's probably going to come through. We like the best players.
Yeah. It's probably going to come through a lot on the podcast. So one of these days, Matt, I'm going to find something you and I disagree on, and I'm going to hit you hard on it. Okay, just so people can at least remember that.
Yeah, man.
So, okay, guys, I am going to, what do I got to do here, Matt?
So,
once
you stop the broadcast, this video should appear in your channels. And then if you want, you can send me the link, or